Welcome back to another episode of What's Next. As you can see by the gigantic smile on my face, I am so excited for you to meet our next guest. Thankfully, we've known each other for well over a decade and have a lot of scar tissue together. But I think his perspective on what it takes behind the scenes to make, create, and deliver a successful business is going to blow your socks off. Notwithstanding the fact that his little pearls of knowledge here, I think will really help you, whether you're current professional athlete thinking about what business I'm going to start next so I don't end up in that abysmal state 3 years post retirement in financial despair, right? As the statistics would say. Or I'm one of the guys who started a startup and the math isn't in our favor either, where it says only 20% succeed. So our hope here in the show, and we talk about what's next, is how do you take it from where you were as a high performer into this world of entrepreneurship, if that's right for you, and what do you do about that? So without any further ado, I want to introduce Mike Brown. I'll give a little background here, working from the front to the back. Mike and I have been, as I mentioned, working together for, 12, 13 years now. Started in our time together at ProtectCell back in 2012. But Mike, before we kind of pull that forward from 2012, which seems like eons ago, maybe just give everybody a brief background on, okay, grew up here in Michigan, went to Michigan State. I'd say go Sparty, but that's only a half truth. Post the Go Green days. What was life like for you before kind of, we met each other in 2012?
Well, yeah, Bryan, thanks for having me. It took forever to get on the show. So, sneaking me in. Kidding aside, always very, well said, well put. So, you did great there. But yeah, grew up in Michigan. It's, by the way, if you haven't been to Michigan, you should come, right? And Bryan,
especially May through October,
as I'm sure you've shared, grew up in California and now have made Michigan home. And if you didn't, we would have never met. And so I spent some time in Michigan State. From there, my first opportunity was out in say the Boston, Cape Cod area between a couple locations. Had an opportunity to get my feet wet in the financial services world. So didn't quite work out with the gentleman I was working for and his two sons, but Pat, if you ever listen to this, I don't regret anything of that opportunity. And I'll say, not everybody you get to work with forever. But in this case, I got to know Pat, and he is like an uncle to me, and his two sons, are the best. So love that opportunity that I had there. And that really got my rotational MBA started. And from there, I went into Quicken Loans, where my dad was in mortgages for 30 years. And so I knew a little bit about that and jumped into, that world and learned how to talk on the phone, learned as a young kid, learned how to just talk to clients and get things done, move things throughout a pipeline. And even then I didn't probably learn what I needed to. And from there, I knew I needed to acquire some analytical background or work, and made my way into commercial lending, got my first experience of helping small businesses. I wasn't in the real estate side on the commercial lending. It was, we were working on loans from 0 to, or call it 250, range. So I guess that time that was my first exposure of people really starting to build businesses up. And, from there, or I guess along that timeline between, the working at Franklin Bank, it was called, actually, it was then changed to First Place Bank and several mergers after that. I knew I needed to have just a little bit more, I'll say, schooling between. So let me take a step back, Bryan. So I always had aspirations of getting into that M&A, iBanking role. And I didn't get the right, I'll say, experience leaving school probably to get on that track. And so I tried to get along that track with some of my commercial lending experience. And so picked up a Master of Science in finance, had some really neat experiences, during that time through the ACG. And, if you're a young student listening to this, if you can get involved in the ACG in your area and learn from those in that in that community. Super smart idea, in my opinion. From there, I went to work for a company called CompuWare in downtown Detroit, just at the, I'll say, early stage of kind of the city coming back a little bit in terms of excitement. And then just after a short time there, I somehow found an opportunity at the company called ProtectCell, which was your business at the time, and really shaped where I am right now. And so always will view that as really the launch pad for me of what I'm doing right now. So I'm going to not get emotional on that part of it, but so I met you in 2012 at ProtectCell. We walked out, I think, within a couple of days of each other in 2015. And only because, well, I think, I had a buddy of mine that was Eric, who was running a Sandler training franchise. And he had taken that leap as an entrepreneur and thought maybe I fit that mold. And, we did some work together with a software called Opportunity, and we spun up a startup, I guess. And at that point, that was really my first, probably freak out at that point of, taking that type of risk. And so we stayed in touch for sure, but not until 2 years later did you say, hey, what are you doing? Mm-hmm. And I was still trying to figure out, the startup that, Eric and I were working on, and what was 5 hours of, you wanted me to look at some reports and see what kind of data we had in front of us, turn into, you allowing me to help you operate, V1 Sports at the time. And, through that, I ended up, doing a lot of things across the company, right? Whether that was in marketing, whether that, that was, closing up the shop for the day, helping shipments get out. It was, helping wherever I could, right, to make sure that that company moved forward.
Yeah, let's use that as a segue. I think that's a good one, right? Because you really sort of to take this specialized skill set of knowing data, living in the data, making good decisions there, and then being exposed to, through Track Left, your software company. Wow, this is a startup. I got to wear a lot of hats here. Then you come over to V1, golf technology company that we had purchased. You were kind enough to come on board and kind of help me make sense of, and I think this is all going to start to come together here, make sense of a company that had been around for almost 2 decades at the time and kind of languished on success and been around. It was a cool staple, but there really wasn't a lot of knowledge on scorecards and data. And so we decided to implement EOS, which I've done for almost 23 years across all the businesses I've built and sold. And you were kind enough to come in and be the integrator. And so I think that's a good pause point to say, what in the hell is an integrator, by the way, in case I don't know what one is, or I'm not using EOS or Pinnacle or any other management system. What is it? And so in simple terms, you've got your visionary. That's typically that founder who had an idea, the crazy idea that made sense, whether it's a product or a service, and they launch that business with their product or service, and all the plates are spinning in the air. And they're realizing the more I think about these other opportunities, they're now starting to come at me. I don't have time to go actually run the business, but I try to do both. And I'm wearing multiple hats. And at the end of the day, I'm working 7 days a week, 12 hours a day. I don't see my family, let alone have any time to take care of myself. And we fall into that, probably a really good idea, probably the right place. But because there's so much burnout and lack of completion of things, most of those businesses fail. And that's how we get into that 20% failure or 20% success, 80% failure rate. So the integrator really is, I'll say, the Robin to the Batman, the number 2 in charge. Some of you would call that a COO if your business has already grown and you're in the millions of dollars of revenue. You really are looking at somebody who can handle all the operations. And I'll just give you a few of the sort of character traits, right? It's going to be somebody who loves the details, uber trustworthy. You are not in competition with. And that's a really key one. This isn't somebody that you're fighting for mental space on which the coolest, newest idea. And Mike and I can tell you this whole show is built around experience, not opinion. And the reason I think we work so well together, our Colby indexes would also suggest it, is where I'm a quick start and I have these great ideas. Mike can take those ideas, distill them down to our staff and make sure they get done, right? It goes from to do And in its simplest form, that's what your integrator is someone that says, I love doing that. I'm really good at it. Go out there into the world, Bryan, and think about crazy stuff. And when you bring it back to me, my job's to tell you how many of those are crazy and how many of those probably make a little bit of sense. And when they make sense, let's get them into process, put them into our plan, and take some action. So, Mike, hearing that description of the integrator, is there anything that I've left out? I mean, you've been in those shoes now with me at Opportunity Seed and across various companies that we've invested in, helped build. Some of them are currently getting ready to sell, which is exciting. What have we left out? Because you've had the chance to come in and be sometimes fractional integrator, sometimes a literal integrator, and then sometimes just coach on helping them put an integrator in place. What else should one of our listeners, viewers, business owners be thinking about if they don't have a COO, second in charge, an integrator? What else should they be thinking about?
Yeah, so I think it's a good question. I think it's, I touched on somebody that can, for me, is you got to have the can-do person. You got to have the can-do attitude. I kind of described that. You did a great job of, what are some of those technical. I think you want to find somebody that has done a lot of things, and that may be at several different places, companies, or they've been able to be in different departments across maybe just a few companies. But I think the part that you want to, one of the filters, I think if you're going to create some type of weighted decision here, they've been in your shoes to some degree. They've taken a shot at starting up a business. They've been side by side with another founder. But I think if they can't relate to what you're going through, if they can't relate to you being on an island, I mean, it's lonely. So then it's maybe a little tougher to have some of those hard conversations. It's harder to ask them to sometimes during those late nights, right? Those times that just have to happen for a company to get through some of those stages. So I think that's a filter I would say maybe is left out in some of the readings that you find. Yep. And I'm sure there's plenty of places that also kind of touch on it or allude to it, in my opinion. But I think that's, Bryan, if you're going to start somewhere, I think that is like the starting point. And then from there, you can find some other layers to that person's, I'll say whether they're the right fit or not for that business owner or to be business owner.
That's a good point, Mike, because I think in saying that they've had a little bit of experience in multiple places, that certainly gives them the ability, again, to speak from experience, not opinion, right? So when you're talking to the marketing department, you may not have been a CMO, but you know enough there to say, hey, I can kind of call bullshit if the firm we're using is giving us a bunch of fluff data, and I think I need to go sit with my CMO or director of marketing and dig in here a little bit. So I think just to pick that as an example is a really good one. Another is that, and you embody this, right? So the term in the industry is called the purple squirrel. Otherwise, other people call it the unicorn, that when you put all the attributes needed for the awesome integrator, somebody that's really going to take you from that 20% success rate north of 60 or 70 or 80, the purple squirrel has a lot of things. Man, if they had everything, that'd be amazing. But, they call it a purple squirrel for a reason. But when I look at that, the one thing you've really displayed that I think sets you apart from the others that we've seen, where we've either had to encourage a replacement or encourage a founder who also thought they were an integrator, is your desire for continuous improvement. So I think as you mentioned those, I have my hand in a few different things. I think that's also your curiosity on how do they work? How does it work? What can get better here? And so I'd also say, to the group listening, if you're out there searching, or you maybe have somebody now who is not a continuous learner, who isn't curious about those things. This isn't just a person who's a robot, right? AI will never, ever replace an integrator. The integrator is the person who takes that data that AI is every day figuring out a better way to go gather and put to use. But the integrator actually implements that information across the network, right, across your platform. So I think that continuous learning is the thing that I'd also say, Mike, is one of your superpowers for sure. And if anybody's looking, I think that's super important. And I'm going to rip off a couple of stats here. So Gino Wickman, founder of EOS, did a study across 20,000 businesses and found that those who implemented EOS with an integrator, right? Because you can do it without. Those that did it with, 81% of them saw larger than a 30% jump in revenue in the first year, right? So that also speaks to their ultimate survival rate. And that when doing a sort of a DNA test, if you will, less than 2% of the people on the planet possess the DNA to be a high level integrator. So you look at that and say, man, they're hard to find. When we do get them, we got to keep them. And when we get them, they make a massive difference in the company. And I've personally seen it. So that's why Mike's not only going to be on this show, he's going to be on for many more, because there are certain levels that we can go into that we don't have time to cover in, 30 plus minutes here of the episode. But when you go back in history, you look at Henry Ford had James Cousins, right? James was his right-hand man to make those crazy, bold ideas work. Ray Kroc had Fred Turner. And I think probably one of our most famous, having just watched a Disney movie last night, was Walt Disney and his brother Roy, who could not have been more uniquely different, but perfectly suited to work with each other, belief in each other. Roy's pretty famous for his belief in his brother Walt when he was turned down by hundreds of newspapers at the time, just wanting to write a comic, being an artist, and his brother constantly encouraging him that you've got the right stuff, we can make this work. And I think, where Disney is today kind of speaks to that. So those are just some data points. I'm trying to tee this up for you, not to sell you on the idea, but again, just to say we've seen so many of these businesses. And for Mike and I working at Opportunity Seed, shameless plug, where we do work with companies pre-cash flow positive, maybe they're at cash flow neutral, hitting their head on the ceiling. How do we break through this? Mike, maybe you can talk a little bit about the companies that we've seen, with naming names or without naming names, where they maybe been stuck there. But once we start to put this system in place with somebody who can kind of, keep everything going and make sure that it's getting done on time, talk about the impact, and then maybe relate that to also the work you're doing today, both in Opportunity Seed at Galway Bay Golf, where you're chief of staff there. So I think you can blend some of that experience.
Yeah. So I think, you touched on the integrator, or the filter in which you're trying to find that integrator. And I think you had basically stated, their willingness to be curious. I think their willingness to learn, their willingness to be an expert in a specific department or domain in your company. They may have to be that person for a short period of time, and then you got to rip them back out, and then they're plugged back in somewhere else. So, I mentioned that rotational MBA earlier in our conversation, and I think that's what's been super helpful for me, is that I've learned in snippets across some of these domains, which has allowed me then to be more curious later on in my, call it, career, if that's what it is. So I think that's the type of person you want to find, is that can-do attitude, the willingness to dig into those different departments and think for you. So I think and Bryan, help me right with where we are, in terms of helping that, finding that, what's the next step I think you're looking for, right?
I think it's just examples that you might have that would say, we're not looking for train wrecks here, but where a really good idea or well-intentioned company may have just been lacking somebody to really take that visionary's ideas and hold the team accountable to a scorecard. I think that's the simplest way to put it.
So our own experiences, we've seen groups that actually have the right integrator already in place. They just didn't have the system. And so they were able to, just with us spending a little bit of time with them, they were able to move that incremental step, happen so much quicker for them, because they already had that right person. That visionary or co-founders were already in sync. And so they just needed to be caught up on what the system should be, and then how to implement it across their team, right? And how to create buy-in. To me, that's a best case scenario. In some cases, we've seen where you have the right visionary, with the right system already, potentially, right? Or they're maybe scratching the surface. They've read some books. They're like, we're already kind of using it, but we're not doing a good job of executing it. And that might be because the integrator might not be working, right? Or they just couldn't be disciplined with the system on a weekly or quarterly basis. So, Bryan, it's, the examples for us, and I don't know if we want to I'll get into specifics. I think it does vary, but if you're somebody who's already to that point where they've proven the product, it's out, you're out there, you're cash flow positive, you're super primed for, and if you may already have that person, and don't forget about looking internally, because it's somebody that just is going to keep moving those. I'm going through that right now, actually, as much as you've set me up to be, hey, your integrator operating Galway Bay. I'm starting to be more of that borderline visionary where I need that person now. I'm actually noticing things don't get moved quick enough because I now don't have that right person to help me keep moving things. And so as much as you've complimented me on being able to move things, I'm now personally going through that. So it's made me think, well, what am I doing wrong? Or are we to a point where we've hit a ceiling that I now have to find somebody to help me? So, and hopefully that's helpful.
It is. I would say, should have mentioned this earlier, to give credit where credit's due. Gino Wickman, as you've heard on this show several times, and we'll hear for many years to come, I'm a huge fan. Love his system. So you'll get the link to Rocket Fuel, which I think really encompasses this idea of what does the integrator do and what does not make up an integrator. So huge resource. That'll be in the show notes. And as Mike mentioned, maybe some of the things that are having you ask the question, what's the difference between now I might need an integrator if I'm moving into this role of maybe a president of a company, right? That could also be interchanged with visionary. And do I need an integrator or do I need a executive or personal assistant, right? Because I think that almost, Mike, as you and I talked about earlier, could almost be its own show. But the one thing an integrator is not is a personal assistant. So I want to be crystal clear. This isn't somebody who books your travel, helps organize your calendar, make sure if you're going to do a speaking engagement, the dry cleaning set and your hotel reservations are made. That is not what an integrator is. An integrator is literally running the guts of the company and would never have time to do that stuff. So I think just understanding, I'm giving you pretty extreme examples here of what they do and don't do. But Mike, to your point, as you're running into that now, as you're moving into the role of president of the company, it's a good decision point, right? That we are still wrestling with, I think, at Galway Bay, and many do at other companies. I know with Josh Jacobs at College Golf Experience, he's wrestling with that as his company's growing. And Sam Rosen at DeskPass, just to name a few that are sort of in our portfolio and have seen acquisition and growth and new investment. It started to open up different opportunities for them to leverage their system that they've all agreed and put in place to now, how do we kind of get the best of the best from the small things, right? It's a lot of bunts and singles. We say that a lot here. You're not always swinging for the fence. That might be the visionary's job, but the integrator will tell you that you win baseball games by making sure you steal when you're supposed to and move the runners over at the right times. And that's what, use a baseball analogy, that's what a really great, I think what a great integrator does for the visionary and says, look, our job is to win the game, right? They have to have that win mentality. They got to want to win. They're not apathetic. And when they do, there are times when they're saying, I get it. You want to swing for the fence here. It's time to move a base runner over to second.
So Bryan, in your conversations with business owners, do you tell them to think about strategically with that? If they don't have that integrator, are you coaching them to find that person who could eventually take over the company, right? Does it depend on their ultimate goals of like, gosh, like I would love to exit this company in 3 years and be, in a better financial situation than I am now, like, or is it's probably one of those, it probably depends, right? But curious how are you looking at a future org chart? If, you have those self-talk moments like, man, if I can find the right person, I can actually exit and still keep my company because I have the right person running it. Like how are you coaching clients? And I know when we talked about this conversation, we may have not touched on that. So
no, it's a great question. And it's interesting because as I go through stages of my life, right now, just showing the strategic coach program with Dan Sullivan for this exact reason, that one of Dan's, well, there's two of Dan's things I want to talk about. One is the self-managing company. And as sexy as that sounds, the reality is that creates the freedom. And I'm going to talk about that in a second and hopefully answer your question here, Mike. This is what I talk to with founders, whether you want to sell your company or not. Most of us get into entrepreneurship because we want the freedom. Having played 11 years of pro soccer, I had zero freedom over my schedule and time until I got to the off season. That was my job. I loved my job. It was the best job in the world. I got paid to play games. Awesome. But I had zero freedom of my time. I didn't get to choose that. So I think most high performers, entrepreneurs would say, I got into this because I want my freedoms. And Dan Sullivan would tell you, you get freedom of time is the first thing you need to master. Then you get your freedom of money to kind of get your arms wrapped around, how do I control it? What do I do with it? And then freedom of people. Who are the people I'm really hanging around? And my family, my friends, I want to be able to choose that. I don't want my job to choose it for me. And then ultimately, when those three things are in order, you start to really focus on your freedom of purpose. That's a great question. I talk to founders about that. Like ultimately, at the end of the day, if you had a freedom of purpose to really do what God built you to do, is that ultimately what you'd love to do? And 100 out of 100 say, absolutely. I'd be nirvana. I would have arrived. Forget the financial success stuff. Like that to me is it. You go, okay, well, if we're going to distill this down, bringing it back to the integrator, if putting the right integrator in place gives you the freedom to then start mastering time and money, and you're helping them be the best integrator, which grows your company. Hey, 3 years from now, if someone wants to offer you a crazy amount of money to sell it, good for you. If it's throwing off a bunch of cash and creating the lifestyle for you that you're around the right people and fulfilling your purpose, my guess is you wouldn't sell it. So when we reframe it like that, most entrepreneurs don't go from, I want to build it and sell it in 3 to 5 years. Most of them say, wow, I could actually hold on to this for 20 if that's what it was. If I didn't have to grind it 70 hours a week and miss my kids growing up and coaching them playing baseball or doing whatever. So yeah, great question, right? It's how do we reframe that? And there's no perfect answer to your point. It's got varying degrees. But we find in Opportunity Seeds portfolio, our best alignment comes with founders who are not just building a business to flip it and sell it. Most of them got into it for really great purpose-driven reason. And selling it might only be a byproduct to come back to financial success management, to be able to control that. So yeah, I think that's a great question. That's what we talked to them about. And I think an integrator plays, now that I think about each of those companies in our, not every single one, but the companies in our portfolio that struggle with what might a self-managing company look like, it's typically because we've got a blank in that accountability chart. So it's a great question. It's a sticking point for sure. Having said that, I want to make sure that we wrap with some really meaty stuff. I think we've covered a lot in that. We've covered kind of what you do and how you do it. I think some tidbits of where would I go find this 2% person in the world outside of some resources that we're going to list, right? We've got Cameron's group. I think that's a good resource. Dwayne Marshall with Pinnacle. He's got an incredible resource, not only what is an integrator, but how to go find them. He calls them a G second in charge, but we'll give you a link to all of that. But Mike, what you said earlier was, okay, I'm growing. Let's say, forget the money, 500 grand, 5 million. I don't think we're ready yet to go a job hunt and job search for integrators. It sounds expensive because of how scarce they are. And quite frankly, it scares the death out of me because we're finally just making money. But you had mentioned maybe looking inside. So if we go kind of back to the people that we're thinking about who love the data, definitely when the job gets started, they're the ones that are at the end celebrating with the team like we did it. We launched that product. We completed that budget. We whatever. When you look inside, are there any jobs that you see that you go, oh, if you see that person, or do you think it's more a personality trait?
I mean, ideally, I think you want to find somebody that is analytical. If that's current analyst, if that's somebody who's already touching operations or running operations for you, even maybe call it your current controller or CFO, that's where you are as a business and you have the budget position in your chart and you're not outsourcing it. I think having a person who have some type of analytical background, I think moves it along quicker. I'm not saying that if you've got a director of sales, I'm not saying that person couldn't be it because their background may have started as an engineer out of school and they're able to run your sales for you based on their experiences. So I don't want to rule it out, but I think that's, to me, that'd be a filter for me internally. So if you can find that person internally, you can grow them up and you can create a timeline for them. That might be super interesting because the trust has probably already been established. and all those character traits that you could potentially lose sleep over, you've already kind of picked those off potentially. I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's good. I'm going to throw a term in here that you and I use a lot, which is the team that gets you here is not necessarily the team that gets you there, right? So if you're going from 0 to a million, to your point, you might pick somebody who just has an affinity for getting jobs done. They're just really good. And I'd say start somewhere. Don't leave that box blank because you're scared to death that what happens when we start doing 5 million or 10 million and they really don't have the chops for it. We share in all of our companies. Whoever gets us here isn't necessarily who's going to get us there, meaning that they might get you to a million, but on the way to 5, you might need a new integrator. Doesn't mean you're going to fire the person who was in that role. It might just mean you move them over to a director of operations position, which might still be quite a stretch for them in a $5 million company, but you've been growing them along the way. So don't get hung up on what the 3-year vision is for a accountability chart or an org chart. And gosh, if I put this person there, I'm only going to have to fire that. You're not going to have to fire them. We move people around a lot based on their unique ability, their skill set. We call it GWC. That's a EOS term. Get it? Do they get it? Do they want it? Do they have the capacity? And the get it and want it part are kind of part we hire on that. So that typically is not a place that we struggle with. Capacity is, do you have the educational capacity? Have you been there, done that? Right? Educational, Mike used the term rotational MBA, which I love, right? Have they been gaining that skill set? And then do they have the time capacity of what it might take to be tomorrow's integrator? You don't have to worry about that today. Get somebody in there early that will help you do it. That's our encouragement to you. Our takeaway is that don't get hung up on what it's going to look like in the future. Get someone in there now so you can start doing this, start test driving it, right? It's an easy place, but they have to, again, using experience, not opinion. They can't just want it. They've got to be able to say, I can show you examples. I didn't even care if it was at other jobs. They started somewhere else. When a job got started, I always finished it and I loved it. When the job got started, I finished it and we did better than what was expected. What you don't need is another quick start of, I can get things going, but as long as somebody else finishes it, we're good. That would be the opposite of what, an integrator attribute would look like. So I think that's right on, Mike. Just if I could sum it up, start somewhere, use those kind of things that we talked about. Find somebody within your organization if you can. If you're so big and you kind of realize I need somebody because we're going to go from 5 million to 20, might be time to look outside the organization perhaps, or from 500 grand to, right? So I think both, we always love looking internal first. It's a growth opportunity for anybody. And either way, having an integrator on the team will help. Even if that person isn't currently called an integrator, might be called a director of operations. Just think about integrator when you think about how they move across the platforms. Mike, before we drop, I'd be remiss without, you're running Galway Bay, great clothing company. I think you guys went last year from 1.3 million to in 2024, going to be almost 4. You've tripled revenue, which is amazing in this space. Where can people find what you're working on? What are you guys excited about at GB? And, kind of what else is on the horizon? In the spirit of what's next, which is the show. What's next for you? What's next for GB? And where can they find you?
So appreciate the last little segment here or opportunity to talk about Galway Bay. So you can't find us in stores. So we're 100%, besides a few tournaments that we've done with some clubs, direct to consumer, Galway Bay Golf. In terms of what's next for us, pretty excited about launching a women's line this fall. We've started to get into some junior sizing as a way to get into that channel. So we know the junior game is growing at faster rate than men's or women's side, and the whole game is growing over the last handful of years. But besides what's next, I'll say we're going to still continue to focus on our core for sure, and that's to be one of the best, if not the best, rain outerwear for golf company, and we want to be really good at that. And we'll go outside that, and we have some bumpers in place. But Bryan, we're excited about doing that really well to finish out this year and into next year. In terms of what's next for me, I don't know. I guess it always depends. I'm just looking to continue to learn and the experience in itself, and then having people like yourself and some of our own partners internally who have had great experiences, right? I'm going to learn from those. that's kind of what's next for me. This being on here was those experiences. So thank you for having me.
No, well, you're going to be a regular feature. So excited to get this first one in the books. And I was already writing notes on 4 other topics we could talk about, which would take us into the end of this week. But I appreciate that. Check out GalwayBayGolf.com. You can see some of Mike's handiwork there, an entire team of people from designers and deliverers, but based here in Michigan, which is really exciting, selfishly speaking. So Mike, love the work you're doing with Galway Bay. Go find him at GalwayBayGolf.com. And until then, I want you to reach deep and look for what's next, because if you're staring on what's happening today, you're going to miss it. So thanks for joining us on What's Next.